Today, we're going to go over 15 CSS trends that you need to be following for 2023. So this comes from an article from Lambda Test, and it was written by Mayul Gadia that you can see right here. So we're going to go over this article, and I'm going to provide some additional commentary on some of these trends and what I think is best to kind of pay attention to here in 2023 for a CSS developer. So first off, he talks about CSS Grid as one of the top trends to follow. And he mentions that CSS Grid is a powerful layout module that allows you to create sophisticated responsive layouts, and it's fully supported by modern browsers. It allows you to create rows and columns easily to kind of lay out your application. And Subgrid is a handy feature that has been added to the grid layout, in which you can create a subgrid using a subgrid feature that will mimic the layout of its parent grid, which is pretty cool. It means you can have like grids within grids and just kind of mimic the layout of that parent grid, which is pretty cool. And it says here the layout of the parent grid is applied to the subgrid. And there is good browser support here. 95.9% of browsers support it. So I definitely agree. I think that CSS Grid is definitely a great way to lay out different web pages and can be a super great use case. I think the combination of Grid and Flexbox are two things that CSS developers should definitely know, and I will definitely have upcoming tutorials on how both of those work here on this channel. Number 2, CSS writing mode. So it says, depending on the language, the CSS writing mode property adjusts the text alignment so that it can be read either from top to bottom or from left to right. Say, for instance, we wish to add some text that is read from left to right and from top to bottom. You can see in this example here, they are manipulating the CSS writing mode to kind of have this text go sideways instead of just normally left to right. It says this can be helpful in different languages like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and maybe you'll even do it for English languages for aesthetic reasons for your overall design. So I also think this is something that can potentially have its use case here and there. I can't say I use it a whole lot in my professional applications that I've written, but I definitely think that there are potential use cases on your design and stuff like that in which you might use this. And this is very good browser support, just under 98%. Number 3. Scroll snap behavior. So to control a web browser's CSS scroll snap behavior, CSS offers a valuable collection of attributes. Some of the functionality has been extended, and it says the best thing about this CSS trend is that only 1/3 of CSS users know about it. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't know about CSS snap behavior, and I've been writing CSS code for probably 4 or 5 years now, and I still didn't know about this. So it says that you can use the scroll snap property separated by hyphens, and you can modify the scroll position on a container in various ways. So let's go a little bit further on this, just for an outline of what this is. It says CSS scroll snap is a property triggered during the course of normal scrolling, but here instead of stopping at a point where the user stops scrolling, the web page snaps to a certain position described by the web developer. For example, if a user scrolls to half of the div box, the div box would automatically snap to its top edge. Position depends on what the developer sets. So that's pretty cool. And you can see in these kind of examples here, when a user scrolls to like halfway through the div, it scrolls to fit in the whole container. So it scrolls to fit in the entire edge of that div. So you can set the scroll snap property to automatically snap to a certain position based on where the user is at within a certain container or a div or something like that. So I could totally see this being very useful. And I think that this is definitely a trend to kind of keep on top of and something that you could use right away in your application, setting that snap behavior. And it looks like it's very well supported in browsers, right around about 96%. Number 4, container queries. So CSS has not fully established container queries, though they will. They'll have a significant influence on how you perceive a responsive design. The fundamental notion is that you can specify a breakpoint depending on the size of a parent container, in addition to the viewport and media. It will include adjusting a layout based on dimensions of various containers that appear throughout nested layers of the UI. So for container queries here, to me, it sounds like you can basically, for a child container or a child element, you can size that based on the size of its parent element. And let's look this one up here again. And it says you can size them not only in the viewport, but also on the context of where the component appears. So they allow us to look at a container size and apply styles to the contents based on the size of their container rather than just the viewport, which is really cool. I know that there's been several times in writing my applications in which I would really much prefer to size something based on the size of an element's parent element rather than on the viewport or something like that. So this is definitely something to, keep in mind, pay attention to. I could totally see you using this in your CSS code in which you can size this kind of child element based on its containing element rather than the entire width of the screen. There's definitely been times where I've wanted to use this, but for one, didn't know that it was a thing CSS was working on. And for two, it looks like it only has about 76% browser support. So definitely not perfect here. And you can see that it looks like Chrome, Edge, Safari support it. Maybe the latest version of Firefox supports it, but there are a handful of browsers in which it looks like doesn't support this right now. But it does look like the main ones kind of do. So I would say maybe you could use this in some of your applications, depending on what browsers are most popular for you. Number 5, new color palettes. So it looks like CSS introduced 3 new color palettes, HWB, LAB, and LCH. HWB is an acronym for hue, whiteness, and blackness. It's an easy feature for people to read. You choose the color and then add white and black. And then let's also go look up, and it looks like it stands for lightness, followed by the A axis, green to red, and then the B axis, blue to yellow. And then it kind of gives a more description here. And then let's also look for LCH. And if I scroll down here, it says lightness, chroma, and hue. Lightness can be a percentage, similar to hue, saturation, lightness, HSL. Hue can be a range, 0 to 360. And chroma represents the amount of color. So that's also very interesting. I tend to use like RGBA the most, or a certain hex value, but I could definitely see use cases in which you might want to use a different color palette. So knowing that there's these 3 new ones can definitely be helpful, and 87% browser support. And now that I see it, they go on to describe LAB and LCH here as well in this article. So I did need to go to an external article. Number 6, CSS variables. So also known as CSS custom properties. It's a popular CSS trend in the market since 2015, and it's getting more and more attention. It helps improve redundancy and make code more scalable, readable, so on and so forth. So yeah, I would say that this is definitely one you need to be on top of. CSS variables are super useful. They are useful for the reasons that variables in general are useful in JavaScript or writing other code. So I would definitely stay on top of this. I recently redid the styling of an application to make it themable, and a big part of that was using CSS variables to decide on which themes I should be using, font size, colors, font family, and different things like that. So this is definitely one I think every CSS developer should know currently. Number 7, viewport units. Setting viewport units is a hassle for everybody who has attempted to code a website like Safari or iOS. The mobile browser shows containers set to a size in the unit VH as being smaller than it should be. You need to use a script that automatically resizes to get around this bug. Thank goodness CSS now supports new relative lengths and viewport specifications. A few of these are VW, SVW, LVW, DVW. These measurements are 1% of the width for small. So it looks like small viewport width is SVW, large and dynamic viewport sizes. So LVW is large viewport width and DVW is dynamic viewport width. So it looks like now instead of just supporting VW viewport width, you can now specify what a small viewport does, what a large viewport does, and what a dynamic viewport does. So that can definitely help get around those mobile browser issues, and is definitely something to keep in mind and something that I actually didn't know existed in CSS. Number 8, cascade layers. So if the next element in the CSS cascade has greater level specificity, CSS overrides style changes to the first element. Due to a vast code base, this problem is always present in large projects. Here, CSS layers come in. Cascade layers give developers better flexibility over themes, frameworks, and designs to utilize the cascade system fully. Cascade layers provide direct manipulation and administration of underlying cascade logic, in contrast to the original cascade centered around heuristics. So it looks like you can add additional rules to your CSS layer to establish a hierarchy of those layers. So when you create a CSS sheet, it sounds like you can specify different specificity within that sheet, so you can give it precedence over other CSS files and kind of define how you want your CSS to kind of cascade onto each other, rather than just allowing those default behaviors of CSS sheets. So I would definitely say that cascade layers is something to know about, pay attention to, and I could definitely see you using this when you want to take advantage of the cascade, but you want it to be kind of specific to your application and you want to set the priorities and everything. You can do that with cascade layers here. 87% browser support for that one. Number 9, content visibility. Content visibility property in CSS helps speed up the rendering of the web page, and it says it can help browsers optimize web page content with delayed calculation. So it looks like you can set the visibility of some different content, and that can help kind of page load speed, but it looks like it only has 71% browser support. So, it doesn't look like Safari or Firefox support this yet. So maybe not something to use in your application so far, but something that you could definitely keep in mind. Number 10, gap. Gap property is an emerging CSS trend that helps to define a gap between a row and a column. You can utilize the gap attribute within a CSS grid with a single value to indicate the space between rows and columns. It says before the gap property, you might need to use the margin property, but that has certain limitations, such as adding indent between elements and the edge of the container. In contrast, the gap attributes allows you to specify the indentation between items without using such hacks and gimmicks, and instead merely relies on the language's fundamental construct. So yeah, using grid gap or just the gap property, or you could even use row gap or column gap, that's probably going to be a better idea rather than using margin within your CSS grid outlines. And it looks like it has 93% browser support. Number 11, object viewbox. Another CSS trend is the object viewbox property, and it goes on to say that this basically allows you, when you have some content, like an image or a video, you can decide what you want to be displayed to your web page, what part of that content you want to display to your users. So it says it will come in handy when you only want to show a piece of an image or a video for distinct elements or at different resolutions. And it can be used to pan and zoom pictures and images. And you can see in this little demonstration here, it's only showing a portion of this kind of cat image. So you can decide which portion you want to show there to your users. And this prevents you from needing to use overflow hidden and kind of different things like that. It looks like it only has 66% browser support here, but a trend to kind of keep in mind that might be useful in the future. Number 12, inset. The inset property helps to set the distance between the element and a parent element. It replaces the 4 properties, top, right, left, and bottom, and allows you to see the inset of all elements of all 4 edges in a single command. So it looks like instead of using something like margin and separating a child element from its parent element, you can use the inset property. And if you can see this example here, it looks like they're giving it 20 pixels of inset. So this parent element has 20 pixels of space between it and its containing element. So to me, it looks like a pretty good replacement for using something like margin. And it has 90% browser support. Number 13, variable fonts. And it says variable fonts allow many variations of a typeface to be integrated into a single file instead of a separate font file for each width, weight, or style. Cool. So it looks like you can set a different width, weight, or style using variable fonts. And then you can also kind of specify different italics and other kind of font stretch and different font features using this property as well. So also another thing that's looks like almost 95% support. So something to keep in mind if you're finding yourself needing to use a lot of different variations of a font. Number 14, text overflow. In CSS, the text overflow property is used to indicate the specific text has overflowed and is now hidden. When you add this property, overflowed content will be trimmed, and a custom string or ellipsis will get visible or displayed. So with a text overflow property, if you have some text that's going to be overflowing your element space, you can set this property and it will just add like the ellipsis, the ... like there's more text here, but not enough room to show it, or a custom string. And you can use this property to set that for text that does indeed overflow. 98% browser support there. And number 15, comparison functions. So they're used to build responsive websites with fewer code. It has functions such as clamp, min, and max, used to define upper and lower bound values and compute and compare the values of inputs applied to the function. So it says the clamp function. This function requires 3 parameters, central, preferred, and maximum. And clamp will compute the value of the property based on a central value. And then for the min and max functions, the min determines and applies the value from a range that is the smallest, and the max will do the same thing, but for the largest value. And these have 92% browser support. So definitely some useful functions there as well. So those are 15 CSS trends to keep in mind. I think there's some good stuff in here that I didn't know about. So hopefully that helps you out as well. And I'll see you in that next one.